What do you think when you hear the phrase Brazilian music? Colourful carnival scenes on the streets of Rio de Janeiro, perhaps? Pulsating drum beats and shimmying dancers, vibrant beats and incredible melodies? Well, you're not alone. Brazilian music has a huge following worldwide, and it's our subject for this episode of Start Here. This is Start Here, a podcast from the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music with me, Alexis Ffrench. And this is all about getting under the skin of a genre. And in this series, we're getting into all kinds of genres, whether that be grunge, dubstep, experimental, heavy metal, or more. So, samba, bossa nova, you've probably heard of those terms, but what about sertanejo or baile funk? There's so much to get into, and I have the perfect guide for this episode. My guest is musician, DJ, Brazilian music expert, Patrick Forge. Patrick, so good to be in your company. Now, we always start the show with an elevator pitch, and this can be as extensive as you like. So extensive or pithy and considered, whatever you want it to be. But we're asking for that hard sell. Your elevator pitch for Brazilian music. The floor is yours.
Well, Brazilian music is both harmonically rich and viscerally percussive, sometimes at the same time. It can be quietly intimate, yet vastly expansive, as the country is itself. And I think it's probably one of the most complex and sophisticated musical cultures there is, with an undoubted root in Africa and rhythm.
I love that. It implies, I think, all at once, this kind of diasporic complexity, which to me is a thing of beauty. All of these different flavors and feelings. And when I think of Brazilian music, yes, there's the color and the timbre of the music itself, but I often find myself just thinking about the rhythms, and they are intoxicating rhythms, aren't they? What we normally do this later on in the show, but I'm intrigued. What got you into Brazilian music from the off?
Well, funnily enough, I came at it in fairly convoluted route. I think there was definitely a kind of mini bossa nova revival in the early 80s. Where you had a bunch of British groups who started to explore some of that territory in their music, notably Weekend, Everything But the Girl, more notably Sade.
Yes.
There was this whole kind of slightly retro Brazilian influence, bossa nova influence thing. That was one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it was that I was fascinated by this jazz dance phenomenon that had started to spring up, mainly with DJs like Paul Murphy, and where they were playing very fast-paced fusion music, a lot of which was samba fusion, which was a kind of music which I didn't even really have a name for at the time. I just recognized it, this kind of driving rhythmic thing that was very much based. I mean, and now I can say, oh well, it's very much rooted in samba, but at the time I didn't really understand samba either, because I'm probably the only Brazilian music I was exposed to begin with was bossa nova, and that's where I kind of thought where it started and finished. And then it was only later on that I began to be exposed to more Brazilian music and realized how vast and brilliant and sophisticated and convoluted and this rich tapestry of influences and sounds. And you know, I fell in love with Brazilian music, but in its totality. But to begin with, it was possibly those two things. On one hand, you had fusion, and on the other hand, you had bossa, you know. In a way, the fusion thing came out of the bossa a little bit, but that's all about the story about how Brazilian music spread into North America and beyond.
Indeed, and so we've had the pitch, which I thought was very persuasive, I have to say, Patrick, and your entry into Brazilian music, and people will have their own preconceptions about what Brazilian music is for them, and it will conjure up certain sights and sounds and all the rest of it. But at its core, so divorced from the pithy pitch, we can leave that to one side for a moment. At its core, what are we really talking about when we're talking about Brazilian music? It is this sprawling genre, shall we say, even if that's the right term. I'm not quite sure it is a genre in itself. But what are we talking about at its core?
Well, at the root of modern Brazilian music, if you like, is the samba, which evolved at the beginning of the 20th century, which is really the Bahian influence or the African influence coming down into Rio, where it kind of blends with choro, which was a kind of more sort of folkloric Portuguese form. Choro means cry in Portuguese. Form of music. So those two things started to blend, and I think it's 1917 you have the first example of the recorded samba, Pelo Telefone, and which was possibly stolen and possibly it was registered to Donga, but I think he was possibly the first one to think about, I could register this song. So,
yes.
Often the way. So samba is really the root of it all. I mean, and the evolution of samba, but then samba in itself, one could say, is quite difficult to define, and there are many subgenres of samba. But samba evolved from batuque, from the circle dance, which is very much out of the African tradition.
A drum is involved there, isn't it?
Drumming is involved as well, obviously. Drums and chants fundamentally as the root of that. And you've got the whole story of the way in which African religions survived in Brazil, where you've got the Yoruba and Bantu traditions that managed to survive through syncretism, through that blending with the Catholic Church. I think that's that huge difference that you've got between Catholicism and Protestantism in colonial societies, where which represented different ways of dealing with things. But those religions were able to kind of sneak in. The African religion sneak into the kind of into the Catholic kind of framework by substituting saints with Yoruba deities, etc. So that African element is so strong in Brazilian music, and even though it may not be recognised in some of the more subtler forms, particularly in Bossa Nova, it's still very much there.
Still evident, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those new to Brazilian music, and there are plenty of us, that samba word, all sorts of things come to mind, thinking rhythmic, colourful, but at its core, in terms of its foundational DNA, what can we expect to hear? What are the component parts of a samba?
Well, to simplify it, let's just break it down to the rhythm, and it's kind of 2 and 4 swing, the bip, bom, bip, bom, which is the foundation of the rhythm. And then you've got laid on top of that, you've got various accents and other rhythmic qualities. But that swing is the most pervasive quality that filters through so much of Brazilian music. And I mean, one of the things about the Brazilian percussion is the pandeiro, the Brazilian tambourine, which is an instrument, when you get an exemplar of it like Ayrton Moreira, who was a very famous, or still is a very famous Brazilian, luckily he's still with us, famous Brazilian percussionist. He can imitate a whole, percussion ensemble just on the pandeiro. You can make it sound like an army of drummers. So,
wow.
Yeah, so that feeling and that swing and that fundamental rhythmic movement is so intrinsic to all Brazilian music, even when the rhythm doesn't so obviously appear to be samba. That feeling, that swing is still very much in there because it's so much part of the culture. And it's true, say, of Brazilian drummers, of kit drummers, that they probably started playing a pandeiro long before they addressed a drum kit. So that feeling of playing samba infects the way that they approach any kind of drums. And that feeling of samba infuses through all Brazilian music, even when it starts to move away from its samba roots.
Okay, so I'm gonna do 2 and 4. And you gave me a really good kind of percussive effect. So can you just run me by that rhythm again?
I just sound like a fool now.
You're waiting for this.
Bip,
Come on.
Bum, bip, bum, bip, bum, bip, bum, bip, bum, bip, bip, bum, bum.
Boom. And what's in between that?
That might be a bit. That would be like the tambourine pattern on top of that, and you can and then you've got various accents and breakdowns and what have you that happen within that form. But that is the fundamental swing which underpins most Brazilian music.
Oh, that's beautifully described. We really do need to go back far into the annals of history to trace back the roots of Brazilian music, don't we? How far are we talking here?
really, I mean, I suppose, modern Brazilian music, we should talk about it in terms of from when Brazil became independent and abolished slavery, which was very much hot on the heels of each other. Well, it was independent as a kind of remote, as a kind of satellite kingdom, if you like. And then it became established as a republic, and the abolition of slavery happened very much hot on the heels of that. But then you've got vast amounts of, Europeans and European music, which is filtering in. And one of the things I always say about music is that, I'm sure you'll agree, that music was viral long before the internet. That musical ideas cross over cultures, borders, and what have you. It's a language of itself, and musicians pick up on those things. So you've got sort of samba, is developing at the same time as, it's not very far away to go to Argentina. It's not very far away to go to the Caribbean. It's like these musical conversations are happening across borders. And I don't think that you can. It's difficult to imagine Brazil's music as being something which grows up completely in isolation, because of course it doesn't. It's a young country and it's a young music, and in a way that's part of the beauty of it, in the way that it has an almost naive and it's forging its own cultural identity, a Brazilian identity, very quickly, and obviously when they started to do that, they couldn't pretend that it wasn't vastly influenced by a huge African population there. So that element had to become part of it. So samba eventually, even though this very convoluted and very difficult history of Brazil and its, and its interracial sort of difficulties, if you like, samba became part of its national identity eventually. It had to be. There was nowhere else for it to go.
The thing I really love about Brazilian music, not just the rhythm and the African influences and the joy, frankly, that emanates and pours through Brazilian music at its best, but it's also the European flavours as well, and you've already touched on it there. Particularly later on with Antônio Carlos Jobim, and the music of Chopin, for instance, one can hear in some of the way his textures and his harmony shifts, and the complexity and the colour and the warmth of the music. For a musician, as well as everyone else, it's so attractive because there's so much to enjoy. And that's where we hear all those kind of diasporic influences in the music, and we hear there's collision of continents, if you like, and we can hear the travel in the music. So many, at the face of it, so many sort of dissonances and things that shouldn't work, but yet work so beautifully. And it's also a really singular type of music as well. It's one of one, isn't it? Brazilian music. It's so unique unto itself.
Well, I think we're touching on some of the history which is more modern and I'm more familiar with in a way, because when it comes to the roots of samba, I'm a little bit, I'm somebody who's read books, but I don't really understand it intrinsically. But when you get to Bossa Nova in the development of Bossa Nova in the 50s, you've got two characters which are really the foundation, the two people who are really the foundation of that music. One is João Gilberto, who was a self-taught musician, guitarist, who evolved a completely new style of playing guitar. He was born in the Northeast. He was born in Bahia and then migrated to Rio himself. And then you've got Jobim, who was classically trained, initially by a German, with 12-tone music, with Schoenberg and all of that stuff.
Oh, Schoenberg and the Viennese
school. But then rejected that. He notoriously, funny that you should mention Chopin, because he had a bust of Chopin on his piano.
Yes, it's so evident in his music. Yes,
and he was obviously very much a trained musician. And by the time that Bossa Nova came around, he was already working as a pianist in bars at night, and then as an arranger during the day for commercial recording and what have you. So. These two guys between them were able to evolve this style, which also took a lot from jazz. But João Gilberto was somebody who interpreted that himself. He was a self-taught musician. He was learning that music, what he was hearing, in jazz and whatever. He was interpreting that on the guitar in his own way. But the most important aspect of it was that he invented this style which, in a way, imitated the whole of the samba by using his thumb for the rhythmic bottom end, for the bip bom, if you like, and using three fingers to voice the chords on top, and quite a complex mixture of picking and rhythm as well.
Cross rhythms, yes.
And it was a very intimate thing, because, and one of the things that's interesting about that is that it took until about 1958, which I always think is a kind of watershed year in the history of recording, when recording technology suddenly advances to the level that you could really reproduce things well. And João Gilberto famously asked for 2 microphones, which hadn't been done before, because basically a singer with a guitar was often recorded with 1 mic, and suddenly he realized the potential of being able to have a microphone on his guitar and a microphone to sing in, so he could sing quietly, and on all the nuances of his guitar playing could be picked up as well.
That's so interesting.
And then, he notoriously also, on some of his first recording sessions, he was a perfectionist, by the way. He was somebody, he absolutely infuriated producers by being somebody who wanted to direct the session himself. He would stop if something wasn't quite right or whatever. And he notoriously sacked quite a few drummers on his first recording session because he wanted somebody who could play very subtly and unobtrusively, so that the mainstay of what he was doing on the guitar could be heard,
I love that kind of sotto voce approach. And where does that sotto voce quality then come from? What was being said in the music? What did that denote, that very quiet quality? Why was it so important for him to be intimate? And
I think, it's interesting because I think a lot of the samba music that had evolved and preceded that was obviously much more celebratory. It was obviously much more upbeat in terms of tone and what have you. And that kind of, it was a way he invented a style of music that was also, it seemed at the time, I think, incredibly modern. What he was doing by using jazz harmony and this rather counterintuitive way of quietly singing, and the able to make this kind of very intimate music that still had this feeling of samba underpinning it. It was a huge revolution, and him and Jobim, who is, as you've already identified, a consummately brilliant musician and composer, were able to just expand Brazilian music into a whole new range of possibilities,
I love that. I love that. And also for me, listening to their music, they're sort of re-articulating jazz through the prism of the Brazilian experience.
And it became a symbiotic relationship, obviously, because then this music translates to North America, and, Jobim is championed by Frank Sinatra. They make a record together. And then the huge explosion when João Gilberto makes the record with Stan Getz in 1963. And, The Girl from Ipanema, which is, at some point we have to get to The Girl from Ipanema, which is possibly the most notorious, well-known, greatest cliche of Brazilian music,
Yeah, absolutely. And what a song. What a song. So perfectly, so exquisitely crafted. If you look at its structure, its lyricism. Tell us about this piece of music.
It's almost difficult to appreciate its greatness, because it is a great song, as you said, and like a lot of Jobim's compositions, it's perfect in so many ways. But because it becomes so emblematic of Brazilian music that it almost becomes difficult to actually hear it without that kind of level of we're here again. It's The Girl from Ipanema. It's the one that everyone knows. So I have a kind of slightly tortured relationship with that song myself, but if I listen to it, like if there's a great instrumental version that Jobim recorded, and if I hear that version, or and then I can appreciate it for what it is,
Yeah. But it's a great piece to appreciate on so many different levels. And just to tell you, I love it so much that I named my son.
Oh, did you? Okay.
I did. Such is my love for Brazilian music and
one of my twins is called Quincy, so there you go.
Oh, there you go. How important is dance in Brazilian music, and indeed in the work that you do, whether it's with your band or presenting and DJing? How important is dance? Is it an intrinsic part, or are there sort of several lanes or schools, for instance? Do we have this very sotto voce intimate school, then you have the sort of rather more joyful? Tell us a little bit about that.
Let's talk about dancing. And it's a big subject, because obviously when you're playing Brazilian music to a fundamentally European, not necessarily fundamentally European, but when you're playing, so we say, in the Northern Hemisphere, you're not going to get a whole bunch of people who can dance samba. You're not going to get people who are trained in the steps or who can do it, but everybody feels it. Everybody wants to move to it. This is one of the most persuasive rhythms that there is, and it can be quite subtle. And what drew me to Brazilian music very much as a DJ was, here's music that has great rhythmic power, but it's not obvious always. It's more in the swing. It can be subtle, yet it can still move a crowd. And that was one of the beauty. What's something that I realised that, I mean, obviously I've lived in a rather rarefied DJ world where we've always played very eclectic music and you know and jazz and what have you, and I come from that background. But with Brazilian music, that was what was so brilliant about it, was that you could create an atmosphere that was intimate, yet everybody was involved in the rhythm, because that samba swing, if it's always present throughout the night, and then gradually people are becoming more and more, just not, I wouldn't say intoxicated with it, just imbued with that feeling, you know. That's the beauty of it. But I'll tell you a little story about when I went to DJ in Brazil in 1995, which kind of encapsulates a lot of the kind of conundrum that we talk about when we're talking about Brazilian music. One of the first nights I played there, I met a guy called Eduardo, who was the resident DJ at the club. And he was like, you've made a revolution in my head, you know, because he'd never heard Brazilian music being DJ'd like that. You know, he knew the things that I was playing, but he'd never really imagined DJing with it. And he said to me, listen, on Saturday night, I'm doing my residency. You can come and play with me, you know, and we can do the thing together. So for me, it was amazing. So, you know, after a while I said, Eduardo, this is your night, you know, do your thing. Let me, you know, you DJ, you know these people, you know how to make them move. So Eduardo went off and he proceeded to play a set of some of the, I wouldn't say the worst music I've heard a DJ play, but some of the most obvious and non-Brazilian music I could imagine anybody playing.
We're talking primary colours here.
We're talking about Twist and Shout by the Beatles. We're talking about even medleys like Jive Bunny. I don't know if you could remember that from the God.
Oh my goodness!
You know, he played some pretty lowest common denominator music. But the thing was, the people dancing to it were dancing in a way that would completely, you know, outclassed any dance floor that you could see in anywhere in the UK, because
even to
the
Jive
hips
Bunny
were so mobile and fluid, and the dancing was so beautiful in that way. So that, in a way, that's the whole conundrum of the whole thing. And you know, one of the things that happens in Brazilian music, and we can talk a bit more about this, but in the 90s, they really lost their tradition in a lot of ways. You know, they really fell out of love with the music of Jobim and all of these things that had happened before. And the thing that really took over, particularly with the, you know, disenfranchised youth, if you like, was the thing they called baile funk, or funk carioca, which is fundamentally electro with really bawdy, lewd lyrics. And it's almost like the antithesis of everything that you kind of imagine Brazilian music might be, or I would say should be, but who's to say what a music should be, what a culture's music should be like? But all of the things that we've talked about, the sensuality, the rhythmic grace of the whole music, was completely abandoned in that music. It was brutal, you know, and it didn't have any, and it had no swing. You know, it was kind of like,
I saw that,
and so that was, and another thing which was, you know, which was always amazed me, was that another music which is huge in Brazil, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, was heavy metal. You know, heavy metal, you know, there were bands, you know, British heavy metal bands who could only maybe fill a medium-sized venue in the UK were playing in stadiums in Brazil, you know.
My goodness,
thousands and thousands of ecstatic people. So there are so many of these, and I think that's one of the things that I love about Brazil as well, is that it can be very contrary and contradictory in the most odd kind of ways. So musically, it's not everything that you imagine it to be, if you like, But what's happened more recently is that there's definitely been a revival and an appreciation of the classic traditions in Brazilian music. And you've got a whole swathe of new generation musicians and what have you who are very happy to embrace those traditions and find more interesting and more contemporary things to do with it as well.
The baile funk is an interesting one. You mentioned the lewd lyrics. Is that a very important part of baile funk? Really?
But you see, one of the things that we haven't spoken about, which we should talk about, which is really important, which is that Brazil was under military dictatorship from 1963, I think it was, until the late 80s. And so all music was being censored. And that's a very interesting aspect when you talk about the development of Brazilian music in the post kind of Bossa Nova years, because in the 70s, you have the evolution. It started to be called MPB, Música Popular Brasileira, so it was just Brazilian popular music because it was obviously encapsulating all of these things that had happened, like the evolution of samba, Bossa Nova, but also by this time you've got lots of other influences filtering in as well from Black American music, not just from jazz, but from funk and soul as well. And you've got, all of these things, and you've got the influence of kind of psychedelia and, British pop music and all of these things. So all of these things become this incredible melting pot. But obviously under a military dictatorship, it becomes this incredibly unifying force. And even though, songs were censored, they were able to sneak around that because Portuguese lyrics are often very poetic anyway. And so they started to use a lot of metaphor and kind of allusion to kind of signify their resistance to what was going on. So there was a great unifying quality to it. There was a great defiance in it. So that's why it's a golden period in Brazilian music. And a lot of that music was not really heard a lot outside of Brazil to begin with. And it took kind of our DJ culture in a way to start exploring that. Even going, if you go back to my roots as a DJ and you go back to the kind of time when I was kind of, before I even really started to play records myself, there was a whole DJ culture in this country, in the kind of soul boy scene, that was very adventurous. They were always looking for alternative sounds to play. So they were playing these records. These DJs were playing some Brazilian records or Brazilian influenced records to dance floors, in clubs in Essex and in London and wherever, because of that kind of very sophisticated palette. And I suppose that's one of the things about the UK's music culture is it's always been very curatorial, and we've always curated very well and, cherry picked our way around the world, finding great things to champion. And that generation of DJs did that, and without necessarily understanding where that music came from, because I think a lot of the time there was a lot of confusion in those old days about what Latin music was. A lot of people didn't really understand the difference between the different Latin cultures in music. For them it was all, oh yeah, that's all Latin or whatever. But they heard the music, they felt the music, they understood where it was coming from in terms of what it could do to a dance floor. So those records were played. So that's a really important strand. And then the Japanese get involved, and they started buying records in Brazil as well. So you've got this, suddenly there's this huge interest in Brazilian music on this kind of in a fairly esoteric way, which is mainly led by DJs and record collecting culture. Whereas where we start to explore this huge swathe of MPB, this music from Brazil from the 70s that uses elements of bossa, elements of samba, elements of funk, elements of soul, elements of psychedelia, often all in the same record. And it's a beautiful thing. So when we started to discover that music, I just suddenly realized that Brazilian music could be so much more, and it could be almost everything that I wanted. It could tick all the boxes at once.
I totally get it. And thank you so much for expressing that and taking us through it. And I have to say, I played the 10 tracks that you shared with me. And there's an immediacy to this music as well that I think just touches people just on such a... it's very visceral music, it finds you where your soul is, and it's so beautifully done. So thank you for that. And I must, so many points of interest here and so many things I don't know. So Baião, That's a term that I've read. Have no idea what it is. Can you enlighten me?
Ah, yes. So we're talking about the baiao. Baiao is a really interesting one because that rhythm, if you like, if you want to put it in basic hip-hop terminology, is boom, boom, bap, boom, boom, bap, boom, boom, bap, which is the same thing that you hear as Jamaican dancehall, or even this day and age, reggaeton as well. You know, it's that same fundamental thing, but it's there in Brazil from way back as the baiao, which is the music that evolved in the very arid regions of the Sertão in Brazil, a mixture of African, indigenous and European influences that went into it. But yeah, the baiao is one of the most infectious rhythms. It's kind of a samba related rhythm, if you like, in a way but it grew from a regional area, you know. And you've got people like Edu Lobo, who was one of the great composers, who took the baiao and put it in a song called Ponteio, which then won a Brazilian song contest.
Okay, so those of us who are familiar with high culture over here in the UK will know of things like Love Island, X Factor, and all those kind of... I'm sure you don't know anything about that at all, Patrick, but the X Factor equivalent in Brazil, is there such a thing? Tell us about that.
You think about the kind of talent shows that we have in our culture, they tend to focus on individual talents, singing or playing an instrument or whatever. Why don't we do this? It's the lost art. But they had song contests. So TV audiences would be voting for their favourite songs. People would be presenting new songs. What a great thing. And I think it's something that should be brought back, because we are losing that great tradition of songwriting.
Yeah.
So Edu Lobo was somebody who made his name through the songwriting contest. So, yeah, but the baiao is again another foundational rhythm in Brazil.
So the baiao we have there. So what else should we know about in terms of terminologies? We've covered quite a few of them today. What have we missed off? And
the thing about it is that Brazilian music will only work for non-Brazilian, non-Portuguese speaking audiences when it has those more universal elements to it. So I think there are certain forms of Brazilian music like pagode, which is a kind of form of slow samba, which doesn't really translate that well to non-Portuguese speaking audiences, but it's a huge thing in Brazil itself, you know, and again, with funk carioca, I don't think unless you're part of that culture, you wouldn't really get it. I mean, there have been times when people have kind of latched onto it, but in a way, you know, it's like it's very much of Brazil, and it's part of you know. Unless you get the cultural references, unless you know where it's come from, it doesn't necessarily work for you. So yeah, this is the whole thing, that Brazilian music is this vast array, and there must be something for everyone in there. You know, if you don't like an aspect of Brazilian music, you probably don't like music.
Oh, goodness me.
well, you know what I mean. It's like, you know, there's rhythm in it. There's things that if you want things that are viscerally satisfying, there is that aspect of it. If you want your music more ballistic, you can find that in Brazilian music. You can find the funk in Brazilian music, but you can also find such lyricism in it, and whether you understand the Portuguese lyrics, it's very easy to get them all translated on your computer these days, and just to understand it on that way as well. But whether you get the lyrics or not, the music will probably speak to you with its soulfulness, with its melodic brilliance, with its harmonic complexity. All of those things will probably speak to you, you know, in some way or another. There'll be an artist who will touch you, because there are so many, you know. So many great voices within Brazilian music.
Absolutely. Listen, Patrick, thank you so much for talking so persuasively and poetically and passionately today. We need a part 2 and a part 3 because there is so much to cover.
You know, it's one of those things where you really can't nail it, but because there are so many different aspects to talk about.
So much.
And, you know, there are things that I could go away from this conversation and say, but I didn't say this and I didn't mention that or whatever. We didn't get into some of these, you know, incredibly important things. But I mean...
Yes. But what we can do, however, is we can finish with the music. And we've touched on this playlist. And for people listening to this and have absolutely bought in to Brazilian music and its foundations, where should they start their journey? If you were to give us 2 or 3, or perhaps even more if you wish, to start their Brazilian, shall we say, their journey discovering Brazilian music, where would you recommend that they start?
Well, start fairly obvious, because I think Bossa Nova is one of the most accessible forms, and you could go to that iconic album from '63, the Gilberto album, and that would be a great introduction to that thing and the way that it works with jazz harmony. So that's a little foundation. But I think that there are so many great places where you should but you need to check this. So there's certain things that you need to check. So I would also say go to Club d'Esquina. Go to this album that Milton Nascimento made in 1972 with Lo Borges, who was still a teenager, but it was writing these incredible songs. And I see that as the songs in the key of life of Brazilian music. So it's a great album. It's got so many different flavors on it. It's got things that are very rhythmic. It's got the original version of Cravo e Canela, which is one of my favorite Brazilian songs. But it's also got things that are much more down-tempo, much more plaintive, if you like. So there's almost a whole world within that album. So that shows you all that Brazilian music can be all of these things at once, as I kept on saying. I would also say direct people to some of the kind of sounds of contemporary Salvador, which is best represented by the great ambassadors, Sergio Mendes, who made this album called Brasileiro, with Carlinhos Brown, who was one of the leaders of this Afro Bloco movement from Bahia and Salvador at that time. So that kind of brings out that very visceral, very drum-heavy side of things. Which I think is another point that people would want to explore. I would also always recommend Banda Black Rio, because they were this incredible example of the gafieira, the dance hall-led fusion of funk and samba. And it gives you can hear that how, they can assimilate a different style of music, as in American funk, but also infuse it with samba. You can hear the samba swing in it all the time. So they're a great band. They were an incredible ensemble. They're, another band who were incredibly influenced by Brazilian music, Earth, Wind and Fire. You can compare the two of them as being these incredible machines who were just able to churn out this incredible rhythm, where the dynamics, the control, the level of groove, the subtle dynamic, all of these things are at play with Banda Black Rio. So they're an amazing, amazing group to listen to. And I could probably go on. There's loads more. There's one more I should always mention. One more who you should always get to mention is Elis Regina, who was one of the queens of Brazilian vocals. And, she was a national treasure in Brazil. And she's, she embodies that Brazilian spirit of being able to... Brazilian musicians have this incredible ability because their rhythmic foundation is so strong. When you get a singer... A Brazilian singer can dip in and out of the time with such ease. They can extend a line here, lay back on a line there. They can push, they can pull. They don't have to stay in this kind of rather rigid pocket. They can just really
natural
play
elasticity.
With that. They've got this elastic quality in the way that they phrase and the way that they play with the song. And Elis Regina, especially if you watch her in performance there's lots of classic videos on YouTube. She's a great another great place to start, I think.
Amazing. Thank you so much for those. Love everything you do, Patrick. Such a pleasure to speak to you today. It's been absolutely delightful.
Thank you. No, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Start Here, which is brought to you by the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music. And if you liked today's episode, why not go back and check out the other 2 series of Start Here? With plenty to get into, from K-pop, musical theatre, stadium pop, folk, there's something for all tastes. Follow ABRSM on TikTok and Instagram and tell us what genre you want to be unpacked next.